Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. In my previous video, I exposed some rather spectacular climate fraud by the New York Times. In this video, I exposed some more New York Times climate fraud, which is at least as bad and probably worse than what I showed you in the previous video. This is an article about Arctic sea ice, which the New York Times published last September. New York Times, September 22, 2017. We charted Arctic sea ice for nearly every day since 1979. You'll see a trend. Arctic sea ice has been in steep decline since the late 1970s, when satellite images were first used to study the region. Scientists say the disappearance of sea ice is largely a result of climate change, with the Arctic warming at a faster rate than any other region. Let's start by looking at their claim that satellite images were first used to study the region in the late 1970s. And notice that they started their graph in 1979. That's a key date, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. This is a beautiful photograph of Arctic sea ice taken by Apollo 12 in 1972. That's 7 years before the New York Times claims we have satellite imagery of the Arctic. This 1965 article from National Geographic shows satellite imagery of Arctic sea ice. That's 14 years before the New York Times claimed we had such imagery. This 1975 article in National Geographic showed very detailed satellite imagery of sea ice around Antarctica. In fact, you can notice that there was almost no ice left after the summer of 1975, and that was at the peak of the Ice Age scare. But now let's look at the real smoking gun of fraud by the New York Times. This was the 1990 IPCC report, which is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The UN clearly stated that satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. And the IPCC clearly reported that in 1972 to 1975 sea ice extent was significantly less. So now it becomes very clear why the New York Times cherry-picked the 1979 start date. That was the peak year for sea ice. If you start at the top of a mountain, any direction is down. And it says right there, this is satellite observations from NOAA. Now let's go back and look at the New York Times claim once again. They said Arctic sea ice has been in steep decline since the late 1970s, when satellite images were first used to study the region. Well, obviously that's not true. We went to the moon in 1969, and they started their graph in 1979, right at the peak. It's difficult to imagine how journalists could be any more dishonest than these New York Times reporters. But this story gets much worse. Remember that the UN said that from 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was much less. In 1971, National Geographic published this very detailed map of Arctic sea ice extent at the end of summer. Now let's compare that to current sea ice extent. This animation flashes back and forth between 1971 extent and 2018 extent overlaid on top of it. You can see that there's a little bit less ice now in some places, but in other places there's actually more ice than there was in 1971. The massive decline which the New York Times is claiming since 1979 is just due to the fact that they cherry-picked their start date in 1979. Had they started earlier, they would have shown very little trend. Now let's look at what was going on in the Arctic before that 1971 map was made. New York Times, July 18, 1970. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. So in 1970, the New York Times was worried about expanding ice and a new ice age. So when this map was made in 1971, the ice edge had already grown quite a bit. And a year later, in 1972, 42 of the world's top climate scientists sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age within a century. These top climate scientists told the president, "The present rate of the cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century." So we know that prior to the 1970s there was less Arctic sea ice, and that during the 1970s it was very cold, Arctic sea ice was expanding, and the New York Times was worried about a new ice age, as were many of the world's top climate scientists. Now let's look at the history of Arctic sea ice prior to the 1970s. This was the 1985 Department of Energy report, which was the predecessor to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They had a sea ice graph going back to 1925, and what it showed was that sea ice extent was much higher back then, and then it dropped precipitously into the 1950s. Then it started to expand again. We can infer from this graph that Arctic temperatures warmed from the 1920s into the 1950s, and then they cooled down again. And I'm going to be showing you that in more detail in a minute. In this graph, I combined the 1985 DOE graph with the 1990 IPCC graph, and it becomes very clear why the New York Times cherry-picked the start date of 1979. That was the century peak of Arctic ice. Once again, if you start your graph at the top of the mountain, any direction is going to be downwards. It's difficult to imagine how scientific and journalistic fraud could be any worse than the stunt the New York Times is trying to pull here. The 1985 DOE graph showed that the ice extent was very low in the 1950s. Let's see what the New York Times was saying in the 1950s. New York Times, Sunday, October 19, 1958, 60 years ago. The changing face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. So 60 years ago, the New York Times was forecasting that the Arctic would be ice-free within a generation. And this correlates very well with the 1985 DOE graph. Ice extent was declining rapidly. And this paragraph is very interesting. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet thick. So 60 years ago, the New York Times debunked the idea that the ice in the central Arctic is very thick, which is exactly the same fantasy which they're trying to push on the public now. And they said that the ice was only 7 feet or 2 meters thick. Let's see how that compares with current sea ice. This is the current sea ice thickness map from the Danish Meteorological Institute, and it shows the ice in the central Arctic is about 2 meters or 7 feet thick, or exactly the same as it was 60 years ago. Ice thickness is 7 feet thick, just like it was in 1958, as reported by the New York Times. In 1958, the New York Times was reporting that the ice was disappearing and would be gone within a generation. But things changed rapidly. By 1961, the New York Times reported on a unanimous consensus of scientists that the world was getting colder. New York Times, January 30th, 1961. Scientists agree world is colder. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It is getting colder. By 1975, things had cooled down so much that the lead story on the front cover of the Chicago Tribune was, "Brr, new ice age on way soon." In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like the one which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. I'm going to digress here for a minute and point out that the state of New York is suing Exxon because they said they knew that in the 1970s global warming was going to kill us all. But meanwhile, the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune were reporting that there was going to be a new ice age. Nobody was worried about overheating in the 1970s. People were worried about freezing. The winter of 1977 was so cold that it actually snowed in Miami. The three coldest winters on record in the United States were the last three winters of the 1970s. People were not worried about global warming back then. So we know that Arctic ice expanded 12% by 1975. So no surprise that the New York Times cherry-picked out all those years because they didn't want you to see ice expanding. All they wanted you to see was ice decreasing. And in 1975, ships making for Iceland ports had been impeded by drifting ice for the first time in a century. Let's look at temperatures in Iceland and see what was going on back then. This is the NASA temperature graph from the capital of Iceland from a few years ago, before NASA started tampering with the data. This is the actual temperatures recorded by the thermometer. Now it becomes clear why the New York Times cherry-picked the start date of 1979. That was the coldest year on record in Iceland. Temperatures had plummeted since the 1940s several degrees, and Arctic sea ice had expanded. So by starting their graph in 1979, the New York Times was able to capture this period of warming and show a trend of declining sea ice. What they're doing is completely fraudulent. Temperatures in the Arctic are not linearly warming, as the New York Times wants you to believe. Instead, they're cyclical. They go up for a while, they go down for a while, then they go up for a while. New York Times starts the graph right at the bottom and then claims this is a linear trend. That's totally unrealistic and has nothing to do with science. What they're doing is propaganda. Let's see what newspapers were saying during this warming period during the early part of the 20th century. November 1922, Arctic Ocean warming up. In some places, seals are finding waters too hot. The Arctic Ocean is warming up, icebergs are growing scarce, and in some places the seals are finding the waters too hot. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers all point to a radical change in climate conditions and hitherto unheard of temperatures in the Arctic. At many points, well-known glaciers have entirely disappeared. This sentence is really interesting to me. Last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. Well, just recently there's been lots of propaganda about a lack of sea ice around Svalbard, which is Spitsbergen. So things are no different than they were in 1922. And this is what the leading Arctic experts were saying in 1939 and 1952. Dr. Hans Allman, who was the leading authority on Arctic ice, in 1939 said, "All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting. It may without exaggeration be said that these glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse." And the leading United States authority on the Arctic, Dr. William Carlson, in 1952 said, "The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago." Dr. Carlson was president of 5 universities during his career, besides being a noted Arctic explorer. So what's really going on in the Arctic? We know that temperatures go up, they go down, they go back up again. The ice expands, the ice contracts, it expands again. The cycle repeats over and over again. The temperatures in the Arctic correlate very closely with an ocean circulation pattern known as the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation in red. You can see that when temperatures go down, the AMO goes down. When temperatures go up, the AMO goes up. So what's controlling Arctic temperatures and Arctic sea ice is not carbon dioxide, as the New York Times wants you to believe. It's just ocean circulation patterns, which repeat over and over again. And by starting their graph in 1979, the New York Times is defrauding the public into believing this is a linear trend. It's not. It's a cycle. The New York Times is committing fraud. Now let's look at the New York Times claim about the last 10 years. The 10 lowest ice minimums measured each September after the summer thaw have all been recorded since 2007. Well, we know that's not true. We know that the Arctic ice extent was also very low during the 1950s. But let's look specifically at the last decade now. The National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado has been keeping a record of daily Arctic sea ice extent since 2006. And in this graph I've plotted out September 30th Arctic sea ice extent going back to the start of records in 2006. The red line is the trend. You can see that Arctic sea ice extent has actually been increasing over the last 12 years, not decreasing as the New York Times claims. Now let's look at the New York Times' final claim that the Arctic is warming at a faster rate than any place else on Earth, and that the imaginary disappearance of the sea ice is the result of this warming. This is an animation of Arctic temperatures from the Danish Meteorological Institute, going back several years. And this period of time right here is the only time when temperatures in the Arctic are above freezing, during their very short summer. The green line is the normal temperature, and the red line is the actual measured temperatures. You can see that during the summer, measured temperatures, the red line, have generally been running below normal over the last few years, while winter temperatures have been running above normal. But winter temperatures don't really make any difference because they're still way below freezing and the ice is still forming. There's no melting going on then. The only time the ice can melt is during the summer when temperatures have been generally running really cold. What's been causing these spikes in winter temperature in the Arctic recently have been large swings in the jet stream. The same phenomenon which has been bringing cold air and snow into the deep south has been bringing milder air up into the Arctic. The air has been mixing. That causes winter temperatures in the Arctic to go up, and that causes winter temperatures in places like Louisiana to go down. It's not global warming, it's just a movement of the air. And this air in the Arctic in the winter is much too cold to cause any ice to melt. The only time the ice can melt is 70 days during the summer, and during those 70 days, temperatures have generally been running well below normal. That's why Arctic sea ice summer extent is increasing. There has been a significant increase in end of summer Arctic sea ice extent over the last decade. The New York Times doesn't report on that because they're not a news agency. They're just reporting propaganda. Now let's look at what the experts have been saying. 10 years ago, the world's leading climate scientist, James Hansen, the guy who started the global warming scam in 1988, said, "We're toast." Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Well, that was 2008, and it's been 10 years, and there's lots of Arctic sea ice left. In fact, it's been expanding over the last decade since Hansen made that prediction. And Representative Ed Markey of Massachusetts said, "Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later, we recognize him as a climate prophet." And Nobel laureate Al Gore said the Arctic ice cap would be gone by 2014. Well, that forecast didn't work out too well. What about some other scientists? In 2007, leading experts from NASA predicted that the Arctic ice would be gone by 2012. And Mark Cerise from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder said, "The Arctic is screaming." Mark Cerise actually predicted that the North Pole would be ice-free in 2008, and based on his ridiculous prediction, swimmer Lewis Pugh tried to kayak to the North Pole in 2008. Well, he didn't make it very far. In fact, he only made it about 20 miles out of Svalbard before he turned around. He ended up several hundred miles short of his goal because he listened to ridiculous climate scientists. And it wasn't just the New York Times and the BBC reporting this nonsense, but scientific journals and Fox News were saying the same thing. North Pole could be ice-free in 2008. Arctic is screaming. Global warming may have passed a tipping point, from Fox News. And they repeat this nonsense over and over again. In 1958, the New York Times predicted an ice-free Arctic within a generation. In 1969, they predicted an ice-free Arctic within a decade or two. The New York Times failed in their 1958 forecast. They failed in their 1969 forecast. And they're back at it in 2018 saying exactly the same nonsense. The Arctic climate system is now entering uncharted territory, with the computer models no longer providing a reliable guide to the future. Computer models never provided a reliable guide to the future. That's why climate science is such a mess. And then they said, will we see an ice-free North Pole in 2018? Well, summer's over in the Arctic, and there's lots of ice all over the Arctic. In fact, there's almost as much ice as there was in 1971. This nonsense goes on year after year, decade after decade, really century after century. And one last scam from the New York Times. In 2000, the New York Times actually claimed that the North Pole had already melted. And they said the last time scientists can be certain the pole was awash in water was more than 50 million years ago. Well, the North Pole wasn't ice-free, and the statement at the bottom is just sheer scientific gibberish. The New York Times has a long history of lying, cheating, hiding critical data, reporting misinformation, and repeating the same ridiculous forecasts over and over again, which never come true. They're not a news agency. They're fake news. And if you can't trust their climate reporting, why would you trust the reporting about anything else? Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.